Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final installment of the series titled The Gamification of War. This event is sponsored by the Carolina Public Humanities Center, which is designed to bring fun, interesting, and engaging conversations to audiences in and outside of North Carolina. Before I introduce today's guest speakers, I want to briefly reiterate the purpose of this event. Over the last few decades, video games have become an extremely popular medium in shaping our understanding of war/warfare, both historically and currently. Video game developers have found a way to turn certain elements of warfare into campaign narratives, point scoring, and multiplayer, entertainment, and in some cases, a tool to educate consumers about specific wars and military concepts. The first two Q&As with John Regan and Brett Devereaux sought to understand this concept of gamification by discussing the nature of video games. But today, however, I have with me two guests that will discuss a different war genre of gaming, which is tabletop games. Tabletop games have a unique history, and their depiction of war is slightly different from video games, but it's not as popular as the action-packed franchises of Call of Duty or Battlefield. Despite the popularity, tabletop games have the opportunity to teach students or Americans in general about various topics related to war. So this brings me to my guests. Today I have with me two members from Little Wars TV, Keith Stine and Josh Beck. Hey guys, and thank you for participating in this event.
Hi, thanks,
Yeah,
Matt. Thanks for inviting us.
yeah,
Yeah,
good to be here.
yep. Glad to have you all here, and I'm really excited about this interview. So to get started, pretty much, can both of you kind of go through and just talk about, your background, sort of what are you doing currently in terms of career, but also, what sort of brought you to tabletop gaming? Josh, we can start with you.
Okay, I'm Josh Beck, and I'm a physical therapist and a business owner, and I am a U.S. Army combat veteran. And more importantly, for this discussion, I am a tabletop war gamer for the past 30 plus years or so. Um, uh, you know, I although I did reasonably well in high school, somewhat intelligent, got good grades. I didn't want to go to college. Um, in 1989, I enlisted in the U.S. Army, and I went to Fort Benning for infantry school and basic training. Stayed there for mechanized infantry school, and then got sent to Fort Hood, Texas. I was stationed there with the Second Armored Division.
Mhm.
Was with the Second Armored Division about a year, and then deactivated that division and was sent to the other division on post, which was the First Cavalry Division. And then I was only with the First Cav for a month, and we deployed to Saudi Arabia for the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So I was in 6 months in theater for that war, and then my enlistment was up, so I re-enlisted in the National Guard for 6 years, and I was with the 28th Infantry Division out of Westchester, Pennsylvania. And my original intent was to do 20 years in the Army, but I think right around that time I re-enlisted into the Guard, I realized that I wasn't going to make 20 years in the Army, at least not as a U.S. Army infantry soldier.
Mhm.
So I had to, I realized at that point I had a brain, I could do more with my life. I was a leader,
Mhm.
so I got out and went to college, which was not what I planned on doing. So my second career was to start over at the age of like 22. I started over my plan and went to college, and 7 years later, I graduated with my master's degree in physical therapy. And in 2005, I went out on my own and started my own practice. And I've been working for myself as a physical therapist, specializing in orthopedic outpatient rehab and industrial rehab and ergonomics for the past 17 plus years. Um, and my as far as wargaming is concerned, my history with wargaming is kind of split into two phases of my life. With a 10-year gap in between.
Mhm.
So I first got introduced to tabletop wargaming in high school in the 1980s with a game called with a fantasy tabletop war game called Warhammer by Games Workshop. And it was just by, I walked into a comic book store and I was looking for miniatures for actually Dungeons and Dragons because I was also playing Dungeons and Dragons at the time. So I was looking for some type of fantasy sized miniature and came across this whole line of miniatures that Games Workshop produced. And I asked questions about from the owner, and the owner explained. And so I got into my first tabletop war game. Then that was fantasy. It wasn't history. I had no idea that historical wargaming was a thing at the time.
Mm.
Um, but I really believe though the roots to my wargaming go before Warhammer,
Okay.
and I like to go back to a board game that had miniatures, that was detailed, overly complicated, took a long hours to set up, and
Mm.
that was Axis and Allies.
Mm. Oh yeah.
That I think really Axis and Allies as a young kid really was the spark.
Mhm.
It wasn't the fire, but it was like that little spark that got the creativity juices flowing in my brain, thinking, "Whoa, there's little tanks and little airplanes and little battleships, and these can move on the board and represent armies, and they attack, and you roll dice." And that whole kind of started like curiosity in me, but I still didn't know about historical wargaming. So the army and college was going on in my life, and I didn't do anything at that point for 10 years. I hadn't been doing any gaming. When just settled down finally and walked into a comic book store in my town that I lived in, and here in this display case were these miniatures painted that were the same Warhammer Army fantasy, miniatures that I had back in high school,
Mm.
10, 15 years prior. And I was like, whoa, what, I know that looks familiar. And um, long story short, that's where I met Keith, one of the other panelists here today. Um, and Keith was a painter in the store,
Mm.
and he was painting these miniatures. He was painting them beautifully, by the way, and that's why I caught my eye. And I was like, "Whoa, look how I can't paint like that, but I want to know how." So I started talking to Keith about, "Hey, how do you paint?" And he gave me some great techniques. But what he really did is he invited me to come and war game the fantasy war game that the fantasy Warhammer night that they gamed in the back of the comic book store on Friday nights, every Friday night. So here it had been 10 or more, maybe 15 years before since I've gamed, but I came back to it.
Mhm.
And I'm gamed with Keith and he introduced me to some other people and got me back into it. And um, it was from these guys, a mutual friend of Keith and mine, who invited me to another game night, a historical game night,
Mm.
on a separate night, on a Monday night, at the same comic book store. I wasn't really, I really wasn't liking the vibe that was going on with the fantasy war game night.
Mhm.
Uh, the guys just weren't the best group of guys outside of Keith and this mutual friend of ours. And I was kind of lamenting to him during one game, like, man, I don't know if I'm going to come back anymore. I'm not really liking the people here. And so our friend Keith and my friend, his name's Chow. He said, "Hey, why don't you come to historical game night on Monday night?"
Mm.
And I was like, "What? What is that?" Like, didn't know what historical wargaming was. And uh, he said, "Yeah, it's the same thing as fantasy, except it's actual real miniatures, real armies that were trying to represent real battles that took place in either ancient Rome or World War II or Civil War, Napoleonic era." So I came to start gaming with these group of guys on Monday nights and learned all about historical wargaming. And I think the very first army I bought to paint and build and construct and fight was a 28 millimeter Japanese army for World War II that Keith had helped me lay out the color scheme and the palette for the painting. And the rest is, so they say, pun, the rest is history, as the pun goes, right? Because that was it. Like, I left fantasy pretty much behind. I've dabbled in a little bit of fantasy since then, some sci-fi gaming too, but I'm I'm sold on historical wargaming, and I've been doing that now since 2000. So 20. I've been gaming with the same group of guys. I've known Keith now for about 22 years.
It's funny that they Josh and I, our stories converge at the end. So now you know the ending of that. I was interested in history since I was a little kid. I had the Civil War chess set and the Time Life set of books. I don't know if I ever read them cover to cover, but because I was little. But I didn't really think much about history beyond that. I was interested in it. I grew up in York. Josh and I both are from York, so we're close to Gettysburg, and that was a part of our growing up. And then I went to art school. I thought I was supposed to be an artist or an illustrator, so I didn't really think about history much. And I graduated from art school in '95. And my first job, besides cutting meat at Sam's Club, my first job out of art school with my art degree was painting billboards. Like we would paint billboards in a shop, and they would send them out and hang them up. So I did all kinds of billboard paintings. Did that for a couple years. Really liked it. I was good at it. I enjoyed billboard painting. And then we got replaced by a giant printer. They came in and they're like, "We're not doing painting anymore. We're going to print everything out." So they gave us like I think 3 months to kind of transition to some other position, like bill posting or going out and hanging billboards up. And I was like, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to be out in the weather. I like being in a shop. So I didn't really want to do that. And I was dating a girl at the time that she went to Penn State, Maine, and I went up to visit her, and I was sitting in one of her classes. I got her to her apartment early, and she's like, "Just come to class with me." So I sat in this class, just kind of sat in the back, and I was doodling. And then she was a literature class, and just sitting there listening to this literature professor lecture, and like he was telling stories and engaging with his discussion and asking questions, and everybody was kind of like completely wrapped up in what he was saying, and he sucked me in too. I'm not even into literature. And it's just the way that he was talking, and I just had this weird epiphany. I'm like, I want to do that, but for history, because I think that previous Christmas and birthday, my girlfriend had gotten me what was it, Stephen Ambrose book, Citizen Soldiers. It was a fairly popular title. It was around the time of Saving Private Ryan. Or I guess no, that Saving Private Ryan was a couple of years later, but it was getting close to that time period where World War II kind of really blew up and got really popular again, interest in it. And so I was reading those books, and I picked up his Easy Company book, what was it, Band of Brothers, and I was getting back into history again. And then that kind of clicked with this lecture I sat in on. I was like, I want to do that. So I ended up getting my bachelor's in history, and then I went and got my master's, and I was going to go get my PhD, but I wanted to teach for a couple years because that was my main interest and goal, was teaching. So I just put some applications out, sent out my CV, which was not much. I just, I had my graduate work and that was it. And I got a call from Harrisburg Area Community College, and this one guy had gotten fired, professor getting fired, history professor, and they were like, "Can you teach a class on Nazi Germany? Can you start on Thursday?" So I had like 3 days to prepare for this class, and I ended up teaching my first semester, just being completely thrown to the wolves. But I loved it. So, and I've been doing that since, I guess that was 2006. So, and next thing I know, 5 years have gone by and I'm still teaching, and I really hadn't decided to go get my PhD yet. I just kind of put it off. And then the next thing I know, I'm married, and I have a kid, my oldest, and we have a house, and it's like, I guess I'm never going to get around to it. And then I finally did go start on my PhD, and I got partway through it and realized it was expensive. It was far away. I was commuting an hour and a half up to Lehigh from Lancaster. And so I just never really ended up finishing, but I've been teaching for going on 20 years now, almost as long as I've known the guys from the club. So that's where I am. And wargaming, coming back to that, I was like Josh. I started off with D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. I did a little bit of BattleTech back in the day, but that was cardboard counters. And then I got into Warhammer, but I got into Warhammer 40,000, which is the sci-fi version of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. That was my big thing. That's what got me into wargaming as a modeling hobby, like the Space Marine miniatures. And I did that for many, many years. And I was still doing that when I was painting as a store painter at the comic store that Josh came into, where we met.
Lucky for
Um,
me.
yeah. So I was painting for the store. I was painting the miniatures in the cabinet, which is mostly fantasy stuff. And Chalfont, our mutual friend, came in, and he was playing with the fantasy group. And he and I started talking about history, just kind of like, he was a history major too. He had a history degree. Um, and we were just talking about history, and he's like, and I was like, I want to know, is there anything for historical gaming? Are there any rule sets? And so I kind of took an interest in it. And he's like, yeah, done some historical wargaming. I used to do some at the York County Library downtown, and back when he was younger. And he's like, I have a couple rule sets. Let's give it a try. So he came in one afternoon. I think it was on a Saturday. We got together and we played. I can't remember the name of the system anymore. Yaquinto, I think it was called. And we played through a couple turns of that game, and then he and I just started like thinking about how it wasn't a really great system. We weren't enjoying it very much. It was a little too crunchy and detailed and difficult. So we started throwing our ideas around. The next thing you know, he and I both have ideas for writing our own wargame system. And I had never done any wargame writing. He had never done any. But between the two of us, we had one brain that we could kind of put these ideas together. And we ended up starting a war game. We wrote a set of rules, Disposable Heroes and Coffin for Seven Brothers, which was the combination of my infantry rules and his tank and armored combat rules. So we combined the two, and we ended up writing the system. We went to a local convention and we ran a game, and a couple people were interested. So we sold them the copies that we had got printed out. And then we just decided to start a company. It became known as Iron Ivan Games, and we had that for 15 years before we decided to sell it to a company called Brigade Games. Oh, wow. And Josh had the misfortune of being one of our main rule testers for many years. He played many, many, many games of Disposable Heroes. Pretty much every system we wrote systems for World War I, World War II, moderns, French and Indian War, World War I, pretty much everything. And he played all of it. They were the test group for a lot of our stuff for many years. And that's kind of where it all comes full circle back to. And then Little Wars TV comes out of that. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, that sounds definitely interesting, both of you all's experiences. And before I ask my follow-up, it's interesting that you all kind of, talk about the sparks that you all have in terms of, getting into tabletop gaming. And I think it's that part is going to very much become, I hope it's going to become important for, if we have young listeners that might tune into this video, because, just for myself, like growing up, I was a huge chess fan. I wasn't the best chess player, but I always liked watching chess and understanding the strategy behind it. But at the same time, as many people in my generation, I think, I also loved, toys. And like my mom always tells the story about how like I used to set up my toys in my room and like kind of basically just replicate certain battles and stuff. But
I did the same thing, man. I did
exactly.
the same thing.
Yep. Exactly. And I mean, those are the best memories. But at the time, I didn't know anything about historical miniatures. I didn't know that like you could actually like buy things and like paint them, and these are actually historically accurate units. And simultaneously, I was very much interested in history. So a lot of things I was reading, I was kind of replicating with the toys or the action figures that I had. So actually, it took me a while, even up until really probably the last couple of years, where I, found you all's content on YouTube, but also certain professors that I've, taken their classes. They also, have war miniatures. So this is definitely a hobby that I've, have definitely considered in terms of joining. But the follow-up question that I have for you all, is as tabletop gamers, history tabletop gamers, is there a, favorite historical period, or maybe a favorite battle that you might have enjoyed simulating, either before Little Wars TV or during your time in Little Wars TV?
Oh man, I really love gaming in general. It's hard to pick a genre or a period. I would say though, you know, I think my favorite historical period to fight would be American Civil War.
Okay.
Um, I like it's still got that it still has the linear battles that you fought in the Napoleonic era,
Mhm.
except of course the musketry became rifled and the artillery became better. The generals had a lot of flair and unique characteristics to them.
Mhm.
The battles are close to home, so you can visit them. You can. I lived very close to Gettysburg, so I could be at Gettysburg in an hour. Um, so I think for me, I did a lot of, and I still do to this day. I always put on for the club, usually once or twice a year, some American Civil War battle, and I don't do much fantasy or sci-fi anymore. Although Keith probably does a lot more of that than I do. Um, I I also have a big collection of modern warfare. Since I did fight in Iraq, I've kind of taken it upon myself for the club to be um, the guy who does the modern stuff. So I have a huge collection of modern buildings and modern vehicles and modern armies that can be fought anything after 2000 or so.
My interest growing up was Civil War, and I I think when I first got into historical gaming, I was kind of assuming that I would take an interest in that, and I ended up not really being all that. I do like the Civil War, and I like gaming it. But my love was World War II more than anything. I gamed World War II, um, starting off with late war D-Day and like Battle of the Bulge and that kind of stuff. And then the more I got into it, I started to really get into the early war period, the kind of stuff that most Americans forget about. That the fact that Germany and Poland fought. It didn't last that long, but they fought France, and those early parts of the war. I just was always really interested in that. My favorite is anything involving France in 1940,
Mhm.
um, because it's such a misunderstood battle. The Germans, by all accounts, should have lost.
Mhm.
Totally should have lost. They got lucky in a lot of ways, and they exploited a lot of the French weaknesses. But it was the French battle to lose, and just I became fascinated with that, and I love anything that has to do with gaming. 1940.
When you all are prepping for either to paint miniatures or to create certain battle landscapes and stuff, you know obviously it's a huge process to kind of do all those things. What's sort of like you all's favorite part in that entire process?
Ooh, I know. Go
Yeah,
first if you want.
yeah. Go ahead, Keith.
Oh, I love, and I did this for a lot of World War II stuff. Uh, I dive into, I'll look up the battle first, just go online and I'll look it up, and I'll look up the Wikipedia for it, just to kind of narrow down where I'm looking at,
Mhm.
uh, and then I'll start to look up some of the, taking the unit numbers, like some of the units that are involved in it, and then I'll start to go into, so for example, like anything with the U.S. Army in World War II. They're called the Green Books. It's all the U.S. Army books that are on World War II collected online, and they dive down really deep into even the low level stuff, down to company and battalion and regimental. And I like to find, like, if I'm interested in a specific battle or a location, I like to go into those books with knowing which units I'm looking for those units in those green books, and narrowing down the location, like where specifically is this battle taking place. And then I will go on to Google Maps or Google Earth, and I'll start to kind of zoom into that area and pick a spot. And I kind of have in my mind, okay, if I'm going to be doing this on a 6x4 table or an 8x6 table, two of them put together, how can I rotate the map and orient it in a way and zoom into about the right level where I'm kind of replicating that specific terrain, and how do you translate that into a wartop or tabletop game? How do you lay out your roads, and where do you put buildings and trees? And that's kind of how I get my scenarios. It's a creative. I enjoy that process, that creative process of starting with just this idea of I want to do this battle, and then researching it and zooming in that spot. And especially,
I think our prep is very much similar. I think my favorite part of it though is building the terrain.
Mhm.
Is the craft of constructing how the table will look, and building it in miniature, and painting it and texturing it and flocking and putting trees and bushes and
Mhm.
rivers and streams and roads, and how do the roads look and what color were roads. Like,
Yeah.
do you know what color the Appian Way really was? I mean,
I don't know.
was the Appian Way the same color in northern Italy as it was in southern? And thinking of little details like that, and um, I'm currently doing the invasion of Italy during World War II at Salerno. So I'm working on a big project that's going to recreate the Allied landings at Salerno for the British and the Americans uh, in 1943, and I'm doing it in 3 millimeter scale, so it's going to be very, very tiny. But so I need a large area, 8 miles wide, is going to be the tabletop.
You should see Josh built the table for Gallipoli,
Oh, wow.
and laid it out, and it's a high scale map. And what's the peninsula called where it looks like a hand? What was that
That's
called?
Cape Helles.
Capellus, the hand of God, or something like that.
Yeah. So I ended up finding for that map. I ended up finding in the British archives, the British War Museum archives, an actual authentic period map that the British scouts had made prior to World War One. They were basing their landings off of an old map, and that was part of the problem. I got that map, and I have it printed out. The size of the pixels of that map was so large, I had to take it to a special printer, and they said, "Do you want this to scale?" And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, the map that you sent me is 20 feet wide."
Scale. Sure, print it out.
So, all right, okay. Well, I don't. Maybe I don't need it 20 feet wide. Can we put it down to 6 feet wide? So I end up having this huge map. It's really neat. It's an awesome British map because it's actually got handwriting on it from, like, arrows pointing, like, olive grove trees here. That kind of stuff written in it.
You needed a billboard printer for that.
Yeah. No, I needed a painter who could paint it.
You did a good job on that map, though. It's just fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So to talk about the details, to add one little last thing, that's one of the things I like too. Like when I've recreated French towns, I remember looking up French advertising for, like, you would see on the side of buildings, like advertisements for alcohol and road signs, and like just these different things. And I just looking up and just going and typing France 1940 and looking at pictures from that time period in these towns and trying to get a feel for what it looked like in 1940. That's the same thing Josh is talking about, where you get these photographs or maps from the time period, and you can make that connection and try to bring it to the tabletop. Is a really fun experience.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
the rewarding part of it.
It totally is. And when someone notices it and points it out, that's even more rewarding. Like,
right.
Like if someone says to you, "Oh, those roof tiles that you have on that roof that you painted, that's actually what the roof tiles look like."
Oh, wow.
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
I'm glad you noticed.
Yeah, I mean that's excellent, and honestly, hearing you all talk about just the creativity aspect to it, but even in Josh's case, you know, getting archival material. I mean, in essence, you all are doing research, but it's very much fun, interactive, engaging, and you're also applying it to something that you get to kind of reap the benefits of when you kind of complete everything, and then you're actually able to sort of play through the entire tabletop scenario. So which brings me to my next question is, off camera, we talked a little bit about, tabletop games as a way to kind of, enhance creativity. So, just after hearing you all talk about your favorite, parts and different aspects that you love about tabletop gaming, that brings me to my question of what's sort of the mission of Little Wars TV. Obviously you all have content that you put on YouTube and Spotify and stuff, but what do you all sort of hope that audiences can get from, being exposed to these experiences of tabletop gaming?
Well, our main goal was to grow the hobby.
Hmm.
Um, the data is showing that the hobby is graying. It's getting older and older, and we love the hobby. We love doing it. So we want to grow it. But how do you grow it? So the whole idea is, look, well, the current medium of today is YouTube,
Hmm.
online. So we want to, if in order to grow it, then you got to teach it and you got to expose it and make people aware of it,
Hmm.
and you need to reach the youth, because the youth are the people who are going to carry it on when we're gone.
Hmm.
So that's our idea. That's our goal, is make people aware, grow it, teach it, make it easily accessible, because it can be very intimidating when you're getting into it. So, Little Wars TV, we do a lot of stuff on teaching on whether it's how to build terrain, or how to collect miniatures, or where to start, or how to paint.
Hmm.
Keith has taught a bunch of videos on just simply, how do I start painting things, or how do I make this, or how do I make that. Or we also have stuff on our website that you can get, that are free downloads.
Hmm.
Because that's what we hear all the time is people are like, I have no idea where to start. And we've started off with videos, like Josh is talking about, how we're trying to get exposure for the hobby just to let people know that this exists, but then also get them into the hobby with showing them where to start, where to buy miniatures. But also we started to kind of further that. We did what was it called? The Tombstone Tinderbox, which is for Wild West gaming, where you actually game the scenarios that are involved in the shootout at the OK Corral, which takes you the whole way through that whole Cowboys versus Earps saga, and in multiple battles like that are connected to each other. And then we ended up putting it together. It's amazing that the guys from the club of like Greg and have put this all together in a way that we have a box that you can buy.
Hmm.
That I think it's $50, Josh.
Uh,
$50,
I,
$55 maybe.
yeah, it's somewhere around there. Yeah, it's not
Something like
it's not
that.
expensive at all.
Right, it's $50, and it has all the miniatures you need. It has some trees in it. It has a game mat that you can lay out and is the surface that you're playing on. It has the rules. It has literally everything you need to war game, and
Hmm.
that's one of the big goals.
All
Was kind
all
of
in
like
one box.
all in one box. You really literally don't need anything else. It's tape measures, and so you can do all that.
All the
And
rules.
there's a way to like say, here's a thing, and you can buy this, and you can become a war gamer.
Yeah,
Hmm.
$55. I just checked.
Right.
Oh,
So, and that's kind of a continuation of our mission. That idea. Um, so.
absolutely.
And then we also have Raven Feast, which is
Mhm.
our Viking era game, which is completely free. The rules are free to download online.
Okay.
And
And,
it, and,
and we
and it's
actually have.
also very accessible, because it's small. You just need maybe 15 to 20 miniatures per side. So the cost is low. The painting is pretty easy. Your paint, and it's Vikings. I mean, come on, who doesn't like a little bit of
Yeah.
Viking warfare?
A
Right.
follow-up question here is
Mhm.
you know, you all started to kind of talk about how beginners can kind of get started, talking about price, things of that nature. Do you all feel like there are any more, suggestions, recommendations that you would give to beginners? Whether that's like the type of I feel like attitude you should carry into wargaming, whether that's patience or what are any other sort of recommendations or suggestions you have for beginners?
Hmm.
Hmm. Um, I think picking an era of history that you really like, a genre, and start there, because if you have a real passion for French and Indian warfare, you know, or if you have real passion for ancient Rome, then that's start there, because that passion will fuel you as you get into the hobby.
Mhm.
And then we have a lot of stuff at Little Wars TV at our on our website. It really helps you out that helps you with rules and free content. Also on the YouTube channel, all that stuff's for free. You can gain all kinds of knowledge on how to start, where to start, and what to do. But I think it just takes that one person to have a passion with something that you want to do, that you want to do a hobby in the real world. A lot of things nowadays are online,
Yeah.
and people's hobbies exist online. Like, what do you do for when you're not at work? Oh, I'm a gamer, I'm online. It was what they mean.
Yeah.
But this is something in the real world, where you're actually painting something and collecting something and building something, and then you're playing the game on a tabletop in someone's room or house, or at a local store. So you need to have that passion so you can get one other person to do it with you, to game with you, to be your opponent.
Start small too. If you're into the Civil War, don't try to play all of Gettysburg. Start small, buy a couple miniatures, paint some miniatures, like buy a bag. And anytime I get into a new period or a new battle or something, I'll buy a bag of miniatures, or a box of miniatures of just a little bit, just to paint them and see if I'm going to actually enjoy painting this specific thing. Because there are periods that I've been interested in that I don't want to, I have not committed to, because I really don't want to paint the miniatures for that.
Yeah.
I just don't. And I recognize that. So kind of like understanding your own limitations, or finding the things that you really are passionate about and going with those, but testing the waters a little bit too.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Don't buy
Yeah,
1,000 miniatures.
yeah, don't, instead of like, because I think we're also talking about scale. I think it's an
Mhm.
important thing to talk about scale,
Mhm.
because in miniature wargaming, the scale typically ranges from 3 millimeter as the tiniest size man, a 3 millimeter, all the way up to 54. But 54 is not very common, so pretty much up to maybe 28 millimeter is the most common. So it's 3 to
And
28,
that's the height.
and that's
28
the height
millimeters
of a
high.
man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, um, so 28 millimeter, because they're bigger and heavier and more material, they cost more. So if you're trying to do the entire battlefield or Battle of Gettysburg in 28 millimeter, you could drop $1,000. But
Yeah.
if you just want to do Little Round Top or the Peach Orchard, or Pickett's Charge, you can do that just with a few set of miniatures. That's a good advice on Keith's part. The other thing you could do, though, is just go in smaller scale.
Mhm.
If you wanted to do Gettysburg in 6 millimeter, that's doable. You can do the entire battlefield with both sides, Confederate and Union, in 6 millimeter for maybe $200 or $300,
Oh, wow.
which is a lot. So picking the scale also matters.
To kind of transition to the next section, which is basically about tabletops versus sort of video games. My first question for you all, in my first two Q&A interviews with both John Regan and Brett Devereaux, we talked extensively about video games as the biggest medium for civilians to understand war. Tabletops also gamify war, but it's slightly different, and we'll kind of get into that in this section more. But tabletop games are, like you all mentioned, one of the oldest genres of war games. But my question to you all is, can you help us understand sort of how video games have eclipsed tabletops, and sort of just what's the big phenomenon, I guess, around how video games have just kind of just skyrocketed to the most popular thing?
My first thought on that, and you had sent us the questions, and I was thinking about it. I think that the allure of video games is that you can experience it as a personal experience, like with Battlefield or Call of Duty. You're experiencing it as a soldier themselves, from the perspective of a first-person perspective. So you're being immersed in the sound and the feeling of war, like the tangible experience of war through the eyes of the the soldier that you're playing. And so it's a personal kind of tangible real life experience. And I think the idea of people go to the movies and watch a movie and they want to recreate the action. And Call of Duty and those kinds of games are essentially you're actively participating in a movie, but you control the action. And I think that's where the allure of it comes from,
Mm-hmm.
the draw of it. But that would be my take on it.
Yeah, it's the immersion.
Yeah, the immersion.
Yeah, totally. And the other thing too is time investment.
Yeah.
Right.
You can boot up a system in 30 seconds and be in game running around with bullets flying over your head in a minute.
And quit when you have something to do.
Yep.
It's flexible that way.
Yep. And if you're located in Anchorage, Alaska, you could play with people all over the world. You're not, you don't have to find a group of friends to do it.
Right.
So with tabletop gaming, you just can't boot up a game in 30 seconds and start playing. The time investment is so much larger: purchasing, painting, building terrain, getting the table together, researching your battle, putting it on the tabletop, finding a couple of friends to game it with you, having the space to store the stuff, to game it, because most of the game spaces are 4x4 feet or 4x6 feet, or even sometimes larger. All that stuff is eliminated. All the logistical nightmare there is eliminated with computer gaming.
And I think we have a very cynical take on, well, everything's online because people are lazy. But I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily that. I think video games also give you a tangible experience that has value. Something like something you can experience and understand what some of these things might be like. But I kind of understand it too. Like, it is intimidating to start in a hobby. So there's nothing wrong with playing video games. I would love for everybody to war game. Obviously, that'd be great because we'd have more people to play with and more choices. But I kind of get it, and I don't scoff at the idea that kids only want to play video games because they're lazy. I think that's short-sighted. I don't think that's necessarily accurate. I think video games are an opportunity for wargamers to act as a gateway to transition people to other things and other interests. And if some kid plays Call of Duty and gets interested in reading about World War II, then there's something of value there.
This kind of brings me to my next question, though. Also, is we talked about sort of the difference or the immersion of video games and how that kind of offers an alternative experience for players. Do you feel like there's something unique about tabletops? Basically, do you think that tabletops maybe offer something that video games does not offer? With video games, like I said, you all talked about immersion, but do you think tabletop offers something else?
They offer totally different experiences, and I'm fascinated by both. And I think both have a lot of value. The video game is the immersive thing. You can experience what combat would be like with the sound and all that. But tabletop wargaming offers you the ability to stand in the position of military leaders making decisions and then facing the consequences of those decisions. And so, like, when we do Civil War battles and you're playing a corps commander, you're making the decisions that a corps commander has to make, and there are consequences that could be really bad. Like, if you go into an attack and you end up losing a couple divisions, that really gives you this sense that thousands of people died in that, and there is a cost here, even when you win. And I think that was something I took away from wargaming in the past couple of years, especially, that even battles that are victories for one side have a major cost to them. The loss of troops, the loss of morale, the loss of property destruction, and those kinds of things. So I think tabletop gaming really puts you in a position where you have to make decisions and follow through with them or not, and then it will either punish you or reward you for those kinds of decisions where you're controlling the actions of lots and lots of people under your command. And I think it gives you a completely different sense of what war is like than the immersive like experience of a single soldier, you know. And I think that has incredible value for teaching us about military history.
I agree with Keith in that on the tabletop, it's really it it's really easy to be able to get the feel for higher level command decisions, division, corps, army level decisions, even battalion or regimental level decisions, where I don't think in the video game you really get that. There's some that Total War series, I think, does a good job at making decisions about, okay, how are you going to form your army, you know, or where you're putting your spears, where you're putting your horse or your cavalry, you know, how many trebuchets you're going to use for this siege. Those are good. Those are good army level decisions. I like that in the computer gaming, but with the tabletop, you know, I think it's a more noticeable or more prevalent, you know, of these decisions, you know, and there's a lot more variety as well.
Yeah, you start to experience the limitations
Mm.
of different periods. Like I didn't really appreciate how hard it is to maneuver an army in the Civil War until we tried to start to do it.
Mm.
Yeah,
And once you commit to an action, then you find yourself being sucked in, and then your limitations, like suddenly your options become much more limited.
Mm.
And I remember when we were playing some of those bigger battles, like when we did Gettysburg, committing to an action and then being asked to come help somewhere else. And I remember sometimes we're like I can't.
I can't. Yeah,
I got my own fight.
I just shook out into line. What are you talking about?
Right, yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
I mean, it just took me, you know, in game length an hour for me to shake my column out into line. I'm not getting back into column so I can march all the way across the battlefield to
Yeah.
maybe get there to help you.
Mm.
Because the enemy's right there and I can't leave now.
Right.
There'll be a big hole in the line.
There'll be a hole in the line. I'll be exposing my flank to a flank attack or desultory fire. No, I'm not giving up my position on the battlefield. So yeah, it's great. And I think that brings up another point, Keith, is that on the tabletop, we're commonly fighting in teams.
Mm-hmm.
So it's two guys versus two guys or three guys versus three guys. So we're commonly having to work together as a overall army commander and two sub commanders, let's say. And, you know, and we have to work together to figure out our strategy, our tactics, who's controlling what, where are we going to be on the battlefield, who's going to, you know, all those things that, and you have to really learn how to work together with sometimes people you don't really know that well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And especially it really gives you a sense and appreciation of how on the battlefield and in armies, personalities, whether they gel or whether they don't, can play a role in. I mean, that's happened in our club. We all get along, but that's happened in our club where if you put some of the guys on the same side or opposite each other, a game is going to play differently than if they're playing together or, you know, something like that. So you get these interesting places where personality plays a role, and then you really get, I think, an appreciation for what can happen, what can go wrong, you know, once you're in a situation, you know, how that's not how I wanted things to go, and then you're trying to work together, and then the limitations about how you end up screwing things up, you know, like, you know, that kind of stuff is really endlessly fascinating for wargaming.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you know, kind of thinking about some of the things that you all brought up here. You know, in my first two interviews, we kind of both Brett and John, you know, they started to allude to the fact that video games, what they don't do well is that sort of morale / emotional aspect of war. You know, you think of the games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, you know, if you're getting shot at, your screen is like kind of frazzled, but you immediately come out of it.
Right.
Whereas what I think is so interesting, especially in looking at some of the previous videos that you have done, I think it was the British colonial war and against the Zulus, actually. And that was the first time that I saw you all go by a rule set that talked about the morale of like the British troops and things of that nature, and how that kind of had certain penalties against your units. And while you might not necessarily experience the full sort of combat, low morale in tabletops, you're at least exposed to it and you know about it. You're not sort of this infinite soldier, that's the super soldier that's kind of going off shooting everyone and you're just unfazed. So it's interesting that you all talk about that. But another military concept that I think, tabletop gaming does better than video games are, things like maneuvers, understanding the full like operational level of certain battles or campaigns. So understanding that, your tabletop partner might be somewhere else on the map and they have to instantly sort of shift gears to help you out in order to really achieve victory. Whereas in video games, that maneuverable aspect of war is very absent. And like you all mentioned, it's because, in tabletops, you're approaching this conflict from the perspective of a commander, pretty much. So you're sort of top down looking at the whole entire situation. And then lastly, what I thought was very interesting in your responses is this idea of time. You all are spending hours sort of playing these games. So like, whereas video games, maybe you spend an hour like in one match, or maybe 30 minutes in one match. Whereas, Josh, as you mentioned, you were spending an hour sort of, trying to fight your enemy or take out the enemy. Whereas that hour is an entire sort of battle, whereas you all have more time to go. And that could be very much representative of actual war, that, these things don't last 30 minutes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we could do a battle in 3 to 4 hours sometimes, and that might be just day one of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
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 When we did, we've done events with our club where we've gamed all day, from fairly early until afternoon. Well, like on Little Wars, when we did was it Leipzig? No, what was the one in northern Italy?
I don't know. I wasn't involved in that video.
What's that?
I wasn't involved in that video. I don't. That was
Marengo.
the one on the multiple table one.
Yes, yeah, Marengo.
Marengo.
So Napoleon's, one of his early victories. Sort of. It wasn't his victory; he stole it. But we did that all day. I mean, we started early and we gamed until 5 o'clock. It was like an 8-hour day. So, and then the game itself, like a lot of these game systems, a turn will represent several hours, or a couple minutes, or depending on. So time has its own scale, not just the table at a scale, but time has a scale too. And then another thing that I came away with as an appreciation is logistics can play a role in wargaming. The only time that's going to come into play is if you run out of ammo in a first-person shooter, and then you can usually go find some that magically appears. Logistics is not really a problem, but some of the games that we play and some of the simulations we end up doing, supply and logistics can play a role in that, in shaping how the battle starts and the limitations that you have.
Yep, it's a very important. It's one of the key. I think logistics in a game that we play is one of those key factors that limits or helps you, depending on which army you are and which side you're fighting, and depending on the period that you're fighting in. Just like morale is, like we mentioned earlier, how morale is represented on the tabletop and within the rule system. It's a limit. It could be a limiting factor.
Video games, and that you mentioned morale again. One thought I had on that was, a video game, no matter how immersive it will be, it'll never actually make you afraid. You're never going to be afraid for your life. In a video game, it can get realistic in the portrayal, but you actually can't. A game can't make a player scared. Wargaming can't either, but the models that you're controlling can get scared, and they can react according to the game mechanics as if they were. Units will run away, even though you don't want them to, because you could roll, they got beat up and then you roll badly and they can retreat. That happens to us when we game, that we have a whole, we make contact and then part of your line starts to fall back, whether you want it to or not. And then that can really put you in historically accurate situations where you have to adapt to that.
Yeah.
So you can't reproduce fear in a video game in the way that you actually can in a war game. So
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, you know, and this kind of got into my next question about the differences between multiplayer versus, you know, team or collaborative aspects in tabletop gaming. And it's interesting, you know, Keith, that you mentioned or you talk about, you know, rolling dice and things of that nature. I think that mechanic of rolling dice and having those rules and those consequences that are embedded in those rules, it helps. I feel like it helps. It's almost, in a way, it's almost a different kind of immersion because players, at least in the tabletop arena, are being immersed into this idea that there are random aspects of war. So you have to kind of respond and adjust. Whereas, you know, in video games, I feel like when you're a multiplayer, it's all about talent level in a lot of ways. You know, you're kind of provided this map, you don't go outside of it, there's a time limit, but within all of that mechanic, it's literally anywhere between 30 to 60 people. And it's all about really who's the best gamer. And I mean, there's, you know, obviously skill or techniques that go into you know, warfare and units as well, but still it's subjected to this sort of randomness that anything can happen. So I think that it's interesting that tabletop gaming gets closer to that aspect of
Yeah.
randomness. So,
We deliberately try to incorporate that into our war games, and we call it fog of war.
or friction, is it?
And friction. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we always try to mix things up in a battle because war is chaotic.
Yeah.
And
it's not fair.
And every historical account of every battle you've ever read, there is going to be some component of that battle that was random.
Yeah.
That you had
And
no
chaos.
control over. Fog. You wake up in the morning and these two armies are sitting across from each other in a valley, and now there's fog. There wasn't fog there all the days prior, but now there is. It makes a big difference for the fight.
Yeah. Messages don't get through.
Yeah.
The big one, you know, I never got that message. So, and that really, I think that's a really important or great thing about wargaming that video games don't have. Managing chaos.
Yeah, like if you want to call, if you're in Battlefield and you want to call in an airstrike, you call in an airstrike.
Yeah.
You know, in a tabletop game, you got to request an airstrike.
and you might not get it.
You might get it or you might not. And it might be on target or it might not.
Right. Yeah, we've had disasters like that.
Yeah.
No, their column, not mine.
Yeah, no, that's friendly fire. Friendly fire.
Yeah. And that's what I love about it. That makes for a really interesting, sometimes hilarious, challenging game. And we regularly do that where one side will have an overall commander and they'll come up with the plan. I mean, we talk about it usually and we hash some of it out, but when we go into the game, a lot of times as a sub commander, you have to carry out what was planned, what was agreed upon, or what you're told. And I've been involved in games where that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't think that was going to work. Turned out I was wrong. Usually.
Yeah, you usually are.
You usually are. That's not going to work. Oh, look at this.
Yeah, a lot of game systems, Matt, use orders. So you have to issue orders to your units or your troops, and so you have to, and it's usually at a kind of a delayed thing, a mechanic that's delayed. So you have to issue the order that they will get next turn. So you're always you always got to think 1 or 2 turns ahead to make sure your orders are where, you know, are moving your troops or initiating engagements that you think might be occurring next turn or the turn after. That comes down to management, time management, and you only have so many orders, you know, so many turns per game to get this accomplished. So, you know, there's kind of like a rush to it. You got to have a good plan, and you got to listen to your commander, like Keith said. It's not it's not like a video game where, okay, I'm gonna try to go out and get 30 kills in this game and see, if I can get the gold star for most kills. No, it's not going to work on the tabletop if you're just trying to be the guy who wins the most, destroys the most enemy units. It's usually not the kind of game we play.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, most of the goals in our game aren't related to killing the enemy. It's an objective.
Yeah.
The objective could be control of this road network,
Mhm.
control moving around this flank and getting off the other table edge because we have somewhere else to be,
Mhm.
or delaying. We're here to delay and not lose troops.
Mhm.
Try to preserve
Yeah.
as much of our force as
That's
possible.
an interesting dynamic, is how do you fight a battle and not fight?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a challenge in and of itself, and
Yeah.
not lose anything. How can you slow them down without being steamrolled?
It seems like the popular games using things like conquest or capture the flag, most most players aren't thinking about, like, if I go capture, objective A over here, I might be able to cut off the enemy using this road or that road. Whereas tabletops, you all are constantly thinking about these things.
Yeah. Yes,
So
squad level, like we do some squad level and platoon level tactic games where you're in charge of fire teams in a platoon or squads, and fire and movement, which is a strat or a tactic that you use in real world combat. Fire and move tactics, where you got one team laying down suppressive fire and then the second team bounds forward. You're doing that on the tabletop, but I don't see a lot of that kind of stuff happening in computer gaming.
But yeah, I mean, and that kind of brings me to my next point. We talked about this a little bit off camera, but this idea about empowerment versus disempowerment. Video games very much pride themselves on providing the gamer with a lot of agency, a lot of choice, a lot of power. So things like talent, like I mentioned, are very important to be able to play the game. But they kind of release a lot of uh, those capabilities to the player. So whether that's picking your own difficulty in campaigns or multiplayer, whether that's upgrading weapons and all these other perks that you kind of get. So it's very much an empowerment kind of platform. But I was curious, with tabletop games, are there moments, does this binary sort of apply to you all? Do you all feel empowered playing, tabletops, or are there moments where you feel disempowered with maybe the way that the game is going, or the structure of the game? Do you ever feel like this binary applies to tabletops?
I I totally do, in this way, deliberately.
Hmm.
Scenario we do when we tabletop game, when we're recreating a battle,
Hmm.
we're using a set of rules, and
Hmm.
those rules are um can be somewhat general and not specific enough for the actual battle we're fighting.
Hmm.
And so what we do is you have to do some specialized scenario specific rules, which may or may not empower or disempower a particular side
Hmm.
to recreate that problem or existed in the real historical battle that the rules don't simulate.
Hmm.
So, for instance, you might have a rule that says, okay, this unit gets to this army here gets to place anywhere they want on the battlefield hidden,
Hmm.
and they get to set up on a piece of paper and draw where all their units are located before the start of the game. The other side doesn't get to do that. The other side starts on the road, visible, and you are known by everyone where you're at. The other side doesn't have that.
Oh wow.
So when you're playing your game, you're like, oh, okay, one side gets to have this power of, like, I'm hidden, I can do ambushes, I can move around and no one will know where I'm moving, and the other side's like, I'm right out in the open, I'm going to be shot and targeted right from the get-go. And so that's a specific scenario, specific, or a specific empowerment or disempowerment that's very, very common in what we do. Another one that we do that to disempower both sides is to make for double blind games, where you set up a double blind game where both sides are completely hidden, moving hiddenly, and the only time they get placed on the tabletop is when they actually become in contact in vision, which would be in line of sight of each other. Once they become contact to each other in the line of sight, then you put them on the tabletop. The rest of the game, they're completely off board, moving around on a separate map, a paper map.
Yeah, usually you need referees for that, but that can be really fun and tense, because then you really experience what it's like to be a commander on a battlefield and not know where everything is. You know where your troops are.
Yeah.
And then you're feeling, and that's where reserves and things like reserves and reinforcements and scouting, like
scouting
recon,
is very important then.
Yeah, then it's like, oh, now I get it. Now I know why you need recon. Now I know why you need cavalry, because you're flailing blindly sometimes. They're hard to arrange. Usually those games are take longer. They take more management. Usually a ref has to do both maps, but they can be really, really rewarding and disempowering.
very disempowering.
And I think one of the things that we try to do a lot, I know our club does, but I think historical gaming rewards this, is war isn't fair. We don't set up a battle where both sides have the same armies, are fighting on the same terrain, and everything's equal. It's not like chess. In fact, a lot of times you're setting players up where they're in a situation where their goals are not only completely different, but they're not going for the same things. They're like, I think I just kind of repeated that, but my goal is to hold this road network. Your goal is you might have a completely different goal. And you might have a very, very small army, and I'm going to have a much bigger army. And that's not fair. It's not meant to be fair. A good scenario isn't balanced about the size of the armies and everything matching up. A good scenario is balanced in that both sides have goals they can achieve, but should be difficult to achieve. So there's a challenge there. And I think that's what tabletop wargaming does really, really well.
Yeah, I think that's like a little specialty of mine in the club. I do a lot of asymmetric engagements, where things are just not fair. And sometimes it stinks.
Yeah.
If you're like that, we mentioned the tabletop I built for Gallipoli. That's a very lopsided engagement. The British got, in historical sense, they got cleaned up, and on the tabletop, when I recreate the battle, they typically get cleaned up.
Right. So the challenge is, can you do better than your historical counterpart?
Right.
Can you get further? Can you not repeat the mistakes of your historical counterpart, given the same circumstances? War is not fair.
No.
So, and I think that's one of my favorite aspects of wargaming.
Yeah, it's like playing chess. Yeah, sure. Except you get a full set of game pieces, and I don't get my king, or I don't get a queen.
Yeah. Until later in the game.
Yeah. So you're like, what? You mean I don't get a queen? Like, okay.
How's that fair?
How's that fair?
What do we always joke about in the club? How if a battle is fair, somebody screwed up. It shouldn't be fair. If your goal is to fight a fair battle, you're not doing your job as a commander. Ultimately, your goal is to get it as unfair as possible.
Oh yeah, you want to as lopsided of a victory or a scenario as you can possibly get.
Right. Which is fun.
Yeah, and I think
disempowering all.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that I think the only disempowering thing about video games is the possibility for a player to lose in multiplayer. And based on who the player might be, you still might play the game because it's fun. Maybe if you lose, you learn from your mistakes, or you might just never play that game again. There's so many choices for if you lose in video games, whereas it seems like the choices uh, in terms of losing in tabletops is, I think the stakes are different. Like you mentioned, Keith, you're in a lot of ways you're running parallel to like historical choices, um, and you're trying to see if really you can do better than the historical figure currently. Um, but also, I feel like even losing for tabletops, there's just still opportunities to kind of see where you messed up, see how the rules play out, or maybe you learn something different based on this outcome. So I feel like the stakes are definitely different in this sort of binary of empowerment versus disempowerment. Tabletopping can be very, I guess, disempowering in terms of losing or in terms of facing those various challenges that you all talked about. But I feel like there's still this learning opportunity there. Where
Yes.
video games, all there is just really like just losing, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
So
right. And that's a huge factor for me. I've learned a lot from the wargaming I've done, where I've come away with an appreciation for what a commander had to face.
mhm.
Because it's easy to read about history and go, oh well, Lee should have done this, and then when you wargame it and friction happens, and even if it doesn't play out the same way the historical battle does, you lose, you end up understanding more about what real world tactics or strategy unfolds like, and the limitations. And so disempowerment is actually a major learning opportunity. And because we're not a competitive group, and I think that's our group dynamic, is not competitive, we learn a lot from our wargaming. I think we come away with a sense of what it must have been like. Maybe that's different with a really competitive group, but that's just not how. I don't find most historical gamers to be all that competitive that way.
No, and if they are, we usually weed them out of our inner
Yeah.
circle.
And we'll definitely get more into this sort of disempowerment versus empowerment, possibly in larger panel. But I wanted to shift gears to kind of our last section, and really my last question for you all is, we've talked a lot about, the benefits, a little bit about the limitations of tabletop games, and also have compared, tabletops versus video games. So this is my sort of what if segment, but if you had an endless budget to integrate either video or tabletop games into a class, what would you emphasize, or what would you want your students to understand about military history or warfare?
Oh, right. Yes, I would I want them to I would want them to experience a situation where they can understand the costs that are involved in human terms, in material terms, that we have this sense that victory in warfare is you win a battle or you win a war, and there's no, that's great. We don't think about the costs and what it does. So like, I think a really neat exercise would be to war game a like Civil War scenario. If I was teaching US 1 and I wanted to introduce wargaming, a Civil War scenario where they could see that even a victorious battle has a cost in thousands of lives. And with the Civil War, there's that aspect of it. By the end of the war, Lee could win battles, but he was losing men that he was never going to get back. And try to introduce them into maybe a campaign type game where over the course of multiple classes they would play multiple battles and see that, yeah, I won these first 3 battles, but I lost enough troops that I'm not getting anymore, and the federal army keeps getting bigger and they keep getting supplies, and to show them cost of even victory has a cost.
I agree. I like that idea, Keith, a lot, to teach costs and the effects of war over time. In order to pull that off, I think you need a budget that you could build the two. So you need large enough budget for models, so you could build both armies in whatever scale you want to do it in. You would need classroom size to be able to have the tabletop set up over a period of several classes.
Right.
You need
So you
to
could
build
leave it set up.
because it would be a big setup. You're talking maybe like 2 folding tables side by side. Um, You need to build the armies. You need to paint the armies. So maybe the cool thing would be to integrate that into the arts class.
Mhm.
Have that being painted. Have the people who are doing the history class also do the painting as
Yeah.
part of credits towards their art classes.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
So that they're painting uniforms, and they're learning history, you know, the colors of the uniforms and what they meant and why the flags were a certain way, or why, you know, what were the color of certain uniforms and why that was, but they're painting, so it's, you know, it's kind of artistic too.
That'd be cool.
And then being able to do that in every period.
Yeah.
Like being able to
that would
do
be
it
cool.
like in ancient times, modern times, every world war, you know, Napoleonic era. So that's
the
where
Punic Wars.
yeah, like, so when you're teaching your class, your history class, throughout the eras, you go from ancient times, and then you might go to like the Crusades, and then you might go, you know, into maybe Napoleonic era, and then you do some Civil War stuff, and then you go into World War I, World War II, and then moderns. And each time you would have a battlefield and miniatures, and you could teach your lessons on the tabletop that way.
And you could even show them, that gets into showing them the development of changes in weapon systems.
Yeah.
You know, going from changes in you know, not using armor anymore after the invention of gunpowder over time. You know, changes in weapons.
It's important that we begin to kind of integrate some of these hobbies into the sort of realm of education, because inevitably students bring these things to the classroom, whether it's whether it's in the back of their mind or not. They bring these assumptions into the classroom, and the same thing goes for movies as well. But
if they're thinking that, and if they're coming into class thinking about that game last night of Call of Duty, and you're starting to talk wah 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 wah, all they're thinking in their head is Call of Duty. But if you got up there in the middle of your wah 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 and said, "Oh, okay, now you know," and speak to them in Call of Duty language,
yeah,
I mean, now you got their attention. Now all of a sudden they're snapped out of their days, and they're thinking, "Oh, how does this apply to, you know, how is this applying to World War II? I don't get it." And then you can go into the explanation. It's a good idea. It's a good idea. And I think it's what educators are going to need to do in the future.
How do you make it relevant?
Yeah.
It's about making it relevant. Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll kind of end it there. I'll leave it there. Once again, guys, thank you. This was a really, really good discussion. And for my audience members, you know, I hope that definitely you've taken a lot from this conversation. Both Keith and Josh will be at the large panel, which is set for May 11th. The time will sort of be determined until then, but they will definitely be at the large panel. So if you have any questions from this interview, you know, feel free to bring those to the large panel, ask them any and all questions you would like to ask them. Also, one last thing is you know, like they mentioned, they have a YouTube channel, they have, you know, a Spotify, you know, channel on Spotify. They also have a website. So if there are things that you want to learn more about, or if you would like to watch their content, please subscribe to YouTube. Please subscribe to them on Spotify, and also, you know, check out the website, check out some of the content that they have there. I also saw recently you all are doing the Pyrrhic Wars soon, so so definitely go check that out. I highly recommend. Their videos are fun, they're engaging, and you end up learning a lot. So
yes, Pyrrhus is rampaging all through Italy as we speak.
So watch out for that. Exactly.
No one can stop him either.
So definitely check that out. Stay tuned for that. Like I said, subscribe to them on YouTube, and they will be at the large panel. So thanks again, guys.
Hey, thanks, Matthew.